Prime Media audiences. This is your host, Ladette Moleta, and I am here with a special guest today. And our special guest is a renowned economist, Mr. Paul Roberts. I'm going to give Mr. Roberts a chance to introduce himself. Mr. Roberts, welcome to Prime Media. Thank you for taking your time and joining us today. I really appreciate you taking your time from your busy morning to join us all the way from Florida. Mr. Paul Roberts, would you please take a moment and let our audiences know about your you have done in the past or what you currently do, please?
Oh, all right. I have been a university professor. I have been an editor of the Wall Street Journal. And during the Reagan administration, I was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. I was in charge of domestic United States economic policy.
Wonderful.
Today, I have a website that's read internationally. It's www.paulcraigroberts.org. O-R-G.
Great, great. I think you taught at Stanford University. Am I correct? Is that one of the universities
I
you
was
taught?
a research professor at Stanford University, and I was a professor of political economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really honored to have you here on Prime Media. So let's get our conversation started. Today on the news, President Joe Biden and the Chinese President Xi Jinping had a long discussion, has been on the media. I wanted to ask you, since you have pretty much worked in economic policy for decades, what is the difference between the US and China's foreign policy? What's the difference between the two countries' foreign policy?
Well, the United States relies on bribes and threats. And China relies on business. China says we can both be richer. Let us make you richer. And the United States says, here's a bribe. We've bought you. Do what we say. Or it says, look, do what we tell you, or we'll bomb you into the Stone Age. Now, this has a historical element. When World War II ended, the United States was the only intact industrialized country. All the others had their industry, their infrastructure destroyed by the bombings and the war. And so this made the United States supreme. And in fact, it took over the role of the British Empire. And now the world had the American empire. The Soviets had an empire in Eastern Europe. Well, the success of the United States, which was greatly elevated by the destruction of everyone else by the war, sort of created a lot of hubris, a lot of arrogance. And Washington got very much accustomed to using its power to prevail. Now, the main difficulty between the United States and China is that Washington did not expect such a rapid rise by the Chinese to prominence. The American experts were saying, oh, it will be 50 years before China is a powerful country that we have to contend with. And this expectation was clearly wrong. It was more like 5 years. So the rapid rise of China caught Washington off guard. And it's not clear why Washington was caught off guard, because it was the Americans themselves who were boosting China up so rapidly. The American manufacturers moved their plant and equipment, their business know-how, the technology to China to take advantage of the much lower labor costs. And so the Americans began de-industrializing their own country in order to take advantage of cheap Chinese labor. And so they, by transferring their plant, their equipment, their capital, the business know-how, they brought China up very rapidly. Well, Washington, being accustomed to hegemony, doesn't welcome the rise of China in the Pacific. And so this is the conflict from Washington's standpoint. What leverage does Washington have? Well, really, not any, except they're trying to use Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is Chinese, and the American policy for decades has been to recognize there is only one China, and that Taiwan was part of China. This has been the American policy. Well, now the Biden administration is showing inclination to overturn that policy, to recreate Taiwan as an independent state. They're talking about putting Taiwan in the UN. They're talking about putting American military advisors into Taiwan. Well, this will be totally unacceptable to the Chinese. And the Chinese are not going to allow overturning a policy that's been in place for decades, dating back to when China was relatively powerless. Whereas today, it's an amazingly powerful country, both economically and militarily. So this is a serious mistake on the part of Washington. And they're making it because they can't find any other leverage to use against China. And their use, Washington is accustomed to bribery, threats, coercion, and no longer practices diplomacy in the old sense of working things out, trying to maintain good relations, trying to find situations to which both countries benefit. And so this is a dangerous situation, but it's one in which Washington really has a very poor position, a very low chance of prevailing. So that's my brief history of the situation and how Washington is essentially unprepared to deal with countries on its own level.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. I appreciate it. What about towards Africa, with their policy specifically towards Africa? One of the things that Ethiopia has been on the news a lot lately, I mean, to the point where you can't really get on any search engines and not see news about Ethiopia right now. And a lot's going on. And Ethiopia is also, making a lot of headlines. What is the difference? You see that there is a lot of chat and talk between, or it might not be between technically, it's just that there's a lot of discussion about Ethiopia on on the Western media, especially in the US medias, than you would see in Chinese media. So that's also another area where, foreign policy is different. What is the difference in foreign policy towards Africa, or specifically in?
Well, it's the same difference. The United States, its approach to Africa is to militarize it. The United States a few years ago set up what they call the African Command, in which American military began trying to organize, cooperate with African military. And this reflects the way the United States likes to control countries. It subverts the military with bribes and weapon systems, and then uses that military to control the government. Because if the Americans encounter a president or a prime minister who is uncooperative, then they can use the military to overthrow him. So this is Washington's approach. Now, the Chinese approach to Africa, and I'm sure they also give bribes, but the Chinese approach is economic. It's business. It's let's develop these resources together. Let's do business. Let's make you rich. Let's make us rich. And this is a totally different approach, and it's one that involves wider parts of the African countries than just the military, and it's one based on mutual benefit, whereas Washington is looking just for political control, influence. Washington will want Africa to go along with Washington's policies. China sees economic opportunity, and it sees a way to influence people without threats and coercion. I mean, look what happened to Gaddafi in Libya. The United States had established the African Command. They wanted Gaddafi, who was recognized as a leader, to join it and to pull the rest of Africa with him. And he refused, and he said, no, we're not going to be part of your empire. We're going to establish our own currency. The Libyan money is backed by gold. It's going to become the currency of Africa, and so on and so on. And so he was in the way and was overthrown. So that's the difference in the approach of China and the United States. The Chinese approach is likely to be the more successful. The Washington approach is a danger to African countries that intend to go their own way or to have an independent policy. And again, I think the Washington approach comes from World War II. There were no countries of any significant power left but the United States. And it just got used to having its way and doesn't know what to do when it's faced with rivalry. So that's the kind of situation in Africa. How it works out remains to be seen, but it's nonsensical for Washington to be provoking the Chinese in a way that could lead to war. That would be highly unsuccessful adventure on the part of Washington.
I wanted to ask you, America has a very positive influence in throughout Africa as far as education, humanitarian, healthcare, and so forth in the past. But now the younger generation, just like you said, the position that the U.S. was in World War II is not the same as today. The world is changing. A lot of things are changing. Countries are developing. Populations are increasing in Africa and elsewhere. Things are changing. The dynamics, the education, the communication around the world, the intertwining, the closeness that the world shares is no longer the same. The world is a much more interconnected, and some of the policies that was used 50 years ago cannot be applied anymore. Is Washington, like you mentioned, it seems like their policies are a bit outdated. I would think the number one strategic association you would want with Africa, given that they have great resources and so forth, would be a business relationship, would be, to have a business relationship with countries that are developing. And obviously, the Washington does not have that. Is it sustainable for Washington to continue in this kind of policy where they are pushing a tough mentality of basically trying to control countries in Africa?
I think the Chinese have a better chance of being influential in Africa because of their economic approach. But in any particular time, any particular country, Washington can sort of control the situation if it's in a position to overthrow the government. So how it works out, I think with time, the Washington policy will have to change. But the whole problem is globalism. Globalism is a deception that the Western world uses to take control of countries rich in natural resources. And the way globalism works, it tends to monopolize the economies in the interest of the global capitalist class. And this, of course, then puts them at odds with China. When you see the countries in Africa that are converted into almost like single crop countries for export, and then they can no longer feed themselves and they have to import. And then that gets them in debt. And then the IMF steps in. And then the IMF imposes austerity programs and adjustment programs. And all of these are a way of looting the countries. Now, as I understand it, so far, the Chinese don't approach these countries from the standpoint of how are we going to loot them? Can we get them just to focus on one or two crops for export so that they're then dependent on food imports? And then we get them in debt. And then we use the debt to force them to sell more of their assets and so on and so on. Now, that's the way the World Bank, the IMF, the Western world has worked for decades. And they've done the same thing to South America that they've done to African countries. And also, I don't know how much health has been advanced in Africa by the West. I do know that President Jimmy Carter, the former American president, he has carried on campaigns to wipe out river blindness in Africa. But we also know that the Western pharmaceutical firms, particularly the American ones, they have used Africans for experiments. They've experimented with them with dangerous drugs and substances. They've done a lot of damage to various peoples in Africa, including children. And this Bill Gates fellow and the drug companies like Pfizer, they've sort of used Africa to as a human population to experiment on, and this has been at the expense of African health. So, they present themselves, so we're here to help you, but they're not. They're there to experiment. I think as all of this information becomes more widely spread, it will make the Western governments less welcome in Africa. And if the Chinese play their cards right and treat people fairly and honestly, then they will end up as the influential power in Africa.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Roberts. For our last discussion point, I wanted to check with you about the economic situation around the world post-COVID. Do you think the fact that we've had a pandemic is also kind of squeezing superpowers and other countries in development into more chaos or more problem-driven situations? What is your take, and what does this time remind you in history? What era does it remind you?
Well, I don't think we've had an era like this before. The real question is there a pandemic? Was there a pandemic? The evidence is now powerful that the pandemic was created by the PCR test, which was run at such high cycles that it produced false positives. So the way these large number of cases was created was with a test that was used fraudulently. So the notion that these number of cases were so high, I think that has collapsed. That's no longer supported by science. And we see that the World Health Organization has moved away from the use of the PCR test for COVID because it produces such a high rate of false positives. That is, it says somebody's sick who isn't. They call it asymptomatic. He's really got COVID, but he doesn't have any symptoms. Well, this is proven to be nonsense. Now, on the death rate, at least in the Western world, the way they got so many deaths is that everybody who died was said to have died from COVID. Most COVID patients in the West, if they died, it was because they had comorbidities. They had other illnesses that were killing them. But the incentives to the hospital and to the medical profession was to report it as a COVID death because they got more money if it was a COVID death. And so the deaths from COVID were greatly overreported. There's the famous case of a man who was killed by gunfire. He was murdered. He was shot many times. But they had given him a COVID test. And the PCR test had said that he had COVID, which he didn't. And therefore, they put his death down, not to gunshots, but to COVID. There were other cases where a person died in a motorcycle crash, but he had had the PCR test, and so they put him down as a COVID death. If you died of cancer, but they gave you a PCR test and it had a false positive, they said, oh no, you died of COVID. Well, this created the fear and the panic and made people in the West willing to take a dangerous vaccine that was never fully tested. It was put out under emergency use. And therefore, they used the vaccinated to test the vaccine. And now we are finding that the adverse reporting systems in the United States, the European Union, Great Britain, are showing very, very large numbers of deaths and illnesses caused by the vaccine. So the question really is COVID as dangerous as the vaccine? Or is the vaccine more dangerous than COVID? So the whole notion of the pandemic is called into question. It was an orchestrated pandemic. They use a test to exaggerate the cases, and they report all deaths as COVID deaths, whether they are or not. Now, other consequences were the lockdowns. Now, the lockdowns disorganized economies. They broke up supply chains. They destroyed many independent businesses. In the United States, the lockdowns have shrunk the middle class, which was already shrinking for other reasons, so that you get a polarization between rich and poor. The world's billionaires have gotten immensely richer during the so-called pandemic. Everyone else has gotten poorer. So the lockdowns became a way of further destabilizing countries that were already having problems from financial misallocations and so forth. So if you look at it, you would have to say that the only beneficiaries from the so-called pandemic are the billionaires, the pharmaceutical companies, which have made billions of dollars from the vaccine, and the governments that have used the pandemic to suppress the civil rights of people, to impose mandates, to force people to submit to coerced vaccination or lose their job. Now, a coerced vaccination is a violation of the Nuremberg laws that were used to convict and execute German doctors after World War II for medical experiments on people without their consent. Well, a vaccination is a medical procedure. If people are coerced to have vaccination, it is a violation of the Nuremberg laws. So what we are seeing from the so-called pandemic is the collapse of civil liberties in the United States. We had, over this past weekend, the Chancellor of Austria announcing that the unvaccinated Austrians would be confined to home arrest. They couldn't leave their homes. We see the same thing happening in Australia and New Zealand, where extraordinary restrictions are being put on people who aren't vaccinated. Now, in a country like New Zealand, which has hardly any COVID deaths, there are not enough deaths to even be concerned about it. For them to be taking such extreme measures against the rights of people, they're violating human rights, they're violating their own constitutions, they're violating civil liberties. There has to be some explanation for this other than public health, because it's not the vaccinated, it's not the unvaccinated that are spreading the disease. We now know that having the vaccinations does not stop a person from spreading the disease. So there's really no gain from the vaccination. And yet they are forcing people to submit to it or to be unemployed, under house arrest, and so forth. Well, this shows a breakdown in the development of nations toward more civil liberties. This is a return to forms of tyranny. And it's the West that's leading this. And other countries are following it. Why? They think it's good health policy, or they're not paying attention. It's really quite a mystery why countries would go into reverse gear and start repealing all of the rights that have been achieved over centuries of struggle. So here, I think we see the greatest failure of Western leadership. It's been with the so-called COVID pandemic.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roberts. I think we're running out of time. I think we had a great discussion. I hope this is not going to be the last time that you will join us on Prime Media. I hope to come back to you with more topics. I really appreciate you in taking your busy time in this beautiful morning, it seems, from your background from Florida. Thank you so much for joining me and our audiences and Prime Media audiences. Thank you for joining me and Mr. Roberts. I'll be back with another guest. Thank you.